From the moment you hear the word Sparta, you probably imagine men in red cloaks, bronze helmets gleaming under the sun, marching in lockstep towards certain death without fear. Hollywood loves to show them as fearless warriors, demigods of discipline, and the ultimate super soldiers of the ancient world. But what rarely makes it into the glossy portrayals is the disturbing truth about how Sparta actually created those warriors. Behind the myth of glory and valor was a system that treated human beings not as individuals, but as breeding stock, selected, inspected, and judged by a society obsessed with perfection. This isn't just a story of soldiers. It's a story of eugenics, of human engineering, of a culture that tried to design people like livestock, and it begins the moment a Spartan child was born. Welcome to our channel, where we uncover the hidden sexual practices, breeding systems, and intimate histories of civilizations past. Today we're stepping into the brutal world of ancient Sparta and exploring the horrifying Spartan breeding program. Imagine a newborn baby. In most societies, birth was a moment of celebration, of family, of prayers for a healthy life. In Sparta, birth was a test. Immediately after delivery, an infant was carried before a council of elders known as the gerousia. These men examined the tiny body for strength, symmetry, and signs of weakness. If the baby looked frail, sickly, or deformed, the judgment was brutal. The child would be taken to the foot of Mount Taygetus and abandoned in a chasm called the apothete. The rationale was chillingly simple. Sparta could not afford weak citizens. Life itself was reserved for the strong. This process was more than just cruelty. It was the foundation of a larger social project. Spartans didn't just want warriors. They wanted a population engineered for war. Every decision about sex, marriage, and reproduction was filtered through the question of whether it produced stronger offspring. Husbands and wives weren't simply lovers. They were breeding partners in a state-run program of selective reproduction. In many ways, it resembled a controlled livestock program, except the livestock were human beings. In Sparta, the state had far more control over sex and marriage than in most other Greek city-states. Love matches, dowries, or romantic ideals took a backseat to one overwhelming priority: producing the next generation of warriors. Men were required to marry not out of personal desire, but because the city needed children. Celibacy was punished. In fact, a man who reached adulthood without marrying might face fines, humiliation, and public mockery. On special festivals, bachelors were paraded naked through the agora and ridiculed for refusing their duty to the state. Imagine the pressure, not just to marry, but to reproduce quickly and successfully. Women, too, were seen primarily as vessels for producing strong sons. But unlike in Athens, where women were cloistered and silenced, Spartan women had an unusual degree of freedom. Why? Because their bodies were considered crucial assets in the breeding program. Spartan girls were given rigorous physical training, running, wrestling, even throwing the javelin, not because the state cared about their personal empowerment, but because strong women produced strong babies. Their bodies had to be hardened, muscled, and capable of enduring childbirth. In this sense, female athleticism was less about equality and more about eugenics. The Spartans believed that only the physically superior should reproduce with each other. Marriages were carefully monitored, and even within marriage, arrangements could be flexible. If an older husband was considered too weak to father robust children, he might permit, or even be ordered, to let his wife sleep with a younger, stronger man, ensuring that the offspring were fit for the Spartan cause. In other words, the breeding program didn't end with forced marriages. It extended into the bedroom itself, policing who had sex with whom and why. This rigid system wasn't hidden either. It was openly celebrated. In the Spartan worldview, the individual was nothing compared to the state. And what was the state, if not a giant machine designed to churn out soldiers? To be born in Sparta was not to be a child of parents. It was to be a child of the state, molded, inspected, trained, and controlled from the very beginning. And yet within this harsh system, sexuality took strange forms. Men lived together in military barracks from the age of 7, forging bonds of loyalty and intimacy that sometimes turned physical. These relationships were often encouraged, as they were thought to build camaraderie on the battlefield. But even here, the focus was not pleasure. It was function. Everything came back to the same obsessive goal: the making of warriors. By the time a Spartan man reached the age of 30, he was finally considered a full citizen, allowed to live at home and start a household. But by then, much of his life had been defined not by choice but by state-imposed systems of breeding and control. He had been inspected at birth, trained through childhood, and matched with a wife chosen for her reproductive fitness. Every stage of his existence was part of a grand, disturbing design. The horrifying Spartan breeding program wasn't just about survival. It was about building what they believed to be the closest thing to human perfection. A society where weakness was stamped out, where sexuality was weaponized, and where even the most private moments of life were tools of the state. But to truly understand just how far this program went, we have to move beyond birth and marriage, and look deeper at how it reshaped family, intimacy, and the very concept of love itself. The idea of family in Sparta looked very different from what we usually imagine in ancient Greece. In Athens, family was a private space, centered around inheritance and the household gods. In Sparta, family was a means to an end, and that end was the creation of new soldiers. If love and affection happened along the way, it was a side effect, not the purpose. The state claimed first rights over your body, your marriage, and your children. Consider the way Spartan marriages often began. Unlike the elaborate weddings in other parts of Greece, Spartan weddings were secretive, even ritualistic. In some accounts, the bride's head would be shaved and she would be dressed in men's clothing. The groom would come secretly at night, spend a brief time with her, and then return to his barracks before dawn. For years, husband and wife might only see each other in stolen moments. Why? Because a man's first loyalty was not to his household, but to his military unit. Marriage was not for companionship. It was for breeding. The secrecy, the strange rituals, the controlled contact. It was all about ensuring that desire was kept sharp, that attraction was heightened, and that when sex did happen, it was more likely to result in children. But the state didn't stop there. If two people were not producing children, interventions could be made. Husbands who were infertile, elderly, or considered unfit were expected to find substitutes to impregnate their wives. Wives, too, might be instructed to sleep with stronger or more suitable partners. The idea of paternity became blurred. What mattered was not who fathered the child, but whether the child was strong enough to serve Sparta. Imagine the destabilizing effect this had on personal relationships. A man might raise a son who was biologically someone else's. A woman might be commanded to sleep with a stranger because her body was deemed a resource of the state. This practice might shock us, but for Spartans it was framed as duty. The state had elevated reproduction into a patriotic act, one that could override personal feelings. And so marriage was transformed into a mechanism of controlled reproduction, while family bonds were weakened in favor of loyalty to the state. Children, once born, were not nurtured by their parents but handed over to the system. At age 7, boys left home to join the agog, the brutal educational and military training program. From then on, they belonged less to their parents than to their military cohort. Even girls, though they remained at home, were trained with the same ruthless intensity. Their bodies prepared for their reproductive role. Sexuality, too, was bent into strange shapes. Spartan society tolerated and even encouraged same-sex relationships among men. But again, the reason was not love or personal identity. It was function. Bonds between older and younger men were considered crucial for instilling discipline, loyalty, and courage in battle. The body was always a tool of the state, whether in bed, in the training yard, or on the battlefield. It is important to recognize how radical this system was in the context of the ancient world. Most Greek city-states celebrated beauty, poetry, philosophy, and art. Sparta, by contrast, celebrated control, discipline, and the elimination of weakness. While other Greeks pursued romance and leisure, Spartans lived inside a machine of human engineering. And yet, there was a paradox here. By treating sex and reproduction purely as instruments of war, the Spartans stripped intimacy of its private, emotional dimensions. Love existed, of course, it always does, but it had to find cracks to flourish in, small moments of humanity breaking through the rigid walls of the system. There are stories of Spartan women mocking their husbands if they returned from war without victory, of mothers who told their sons to come back with your shield or on it. But behind this famous toughness was a society that demanded emotional suppression, that forced people to accept the state's priorities above their own desires. Imagine the psychological toll of living in a culture where even your sex life was judged by whether it served the military. Yet the program was undeniably effective, at least for a time. Spartan warriors gained a reputation across Greece as the most disciplined, the most fearsome, the most unbreakable fighters. Their society did succeed in producing super soldiers, men who could march for days, endure hunger and pain, and die without flinching. But the cost was staggering. Individual freedom, family bonds, even the tenderness of love and intimacy, all were sacrificed to the relentless pursuit of military strength. Still, cracks in the system began to show. Because the Spartans limited citizenship only to those born of approved unions, their population of full citizens began to shrink over the centuries. By obsessively controlling reproduction, they may have undermined their own survival. A society that treated people like breeding stock found itself running out of stock. By the later classical period, Sparta's once feared armies were a shadow of their former selves and their numbers dwindled. The horrifying breeding program designed to create eternal strength had planted the seeds of decline. When we look back at the Spartan breeding system, it's tempting to see it as a strange relic, a brutal oddity of the past. But in truth, it raises questions that remain uncomfortably relevant. How far can a society go in controlling reproduction for its own ends? Where do we draw the line between encouraging healthy births and violating human freedom? The Spartans crossed those lines without hesitation, and in doing so, they left us a legacy that is both fascinating and horrifying. Think about the mindset behind their decisions. To them, the individual was expendable, but the state was eternal. Babies could be discarded because they didn't fit the vision of strength. Marriages could be rearranged, manipulated, or ignored because love was irrelevant compared to duty. Sex itself was not private, it was political. What we see here is the extreme end of a spectrum that exists in many cultures, the idea that reproduction can be managed, controlled, or perfected. Sparta wasn't the only society to practice forms of eugenics, but it was one of the most systematic. It turned the entire population into a breeding project, where every birth was inspected, every body was trained, and every marriage was subordinated to the same goal. And yet, despite all this control, the system collapsed. Their obsession with purity and strength made them brittle. By excluding too many people, by narrowing the path to citizenship, they created a demographic crisis from which they never recovered. Their decline is a cautionary tale of what happens when human beings are treated as tools rather than as individuals. But beyond the political lesson, there's something deeply unsettling on a personal level. Imagine being a woman in Sparta, told from childhood that your body was not your own, but a vessel for the state. Imagine being a man, mocked and punished if you failed to marry, ordered to share your wife with another because the state demanded stronger offspring. Imagine raising a child knowing he would be taken away at 7, molded by the agog, and perhaps discarded if he didn't meet the impossible standards. These were not just policies. They were lived realities, shaping the most intimate corners of people's lives. And yet there's a strange allure in the Spartan myth. Even today we celebrate their discipline, their courage, their refusal to bow to fear. We admire the warriors of Thermopylae, the 300 who stood against impossible odds. But behind that legend was a breeding program that sacrificed love, tenderness, and individuality. It forces us to ask, is greatness worth the cost when the cost is our humanity? In exploring the hidden sexual practices and breeding systems of the past, we don't just uncover strange customs, we uncover the ways societies wrestled with the eternal tension between the needs of the group and the rights of the individual, between survival and freedom, between control and love. Sparta is one of the starkest examples of what happens when the pendulum swings too far toward control. When sex becomes not an act of connection, but a transaction for the state. As we close this journey through the horrifying Spartan breeding program, reflect for a moment on what it means for us today. We no longer abandon babies on mountainsides. But debates about genetics, designer babies, and state control over family life still simmer under the surface of our modern world. The Spartans may be gone, but the questions they raise are far from resolved. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the hidden, often unsettling history of sex and sexuality. Now I'd love to hear from you. What fact about Sparta shocked you the most? Was it the inspection of newborns, the enforced marriages, or the way the state intruded even into the bedroom? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's start a conversation. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the dark side of history, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next episode, where we continue to uncover the secret sexual practices of civilizations past. Until then, remember, history is never just about dates and battles. It's about bodies, desires, and the strange ways societies have tried to control them.